Well, hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Professor Barry here. We are moving into social stratification, looking at income, wealth, inequalities, and the purpose of this video is to give you a little bit of background and preview to the content for this week and for next week. Uh, a podcast, a video, a couple different write-ups and articles that are really accessible. I'm just trying to understand changes in our economy over the last 30, 40 years and just kind of unpack and think about inequality, stratification. And then also just keeping in mind, we're talking about stratification, thinking also about intersectionality, thinking about how income and wealth not only distributed differently based on class, but also based on race, based on gender, and other parts of our identity. So I'll present information. It's more just like general class income, wealth, without identifying particular racial groups or identifying gender. But keep in mind that this data and information is the collective picture and not looking at particular groups. And what we'll see if we looked at particular groups is there's going to be inequality within our structured inequality of income and wealth. So I want to start. I'm going to try to keep this a bigger video just because it's going through 2 weeks of material background. But I'll try to move it along pretty quickly and efficiently to accomplish the goal of getting it to some major pictures and ideas, just to give you the background that'll be helpful for engaging in the materials for this week and next week. So I think one approach is thinking about sociology as empathy. And empathy is basically taking the position of other and understanding the position of other. So that'd be cognitive empathy, so an exercise or the ability to think about another person's life experience, and imagine what that person might be experiencing, going through reasons why, etc. Affective empathy is more on the emotional side, like emotionally identifying with what or emotionally trying to experience what another person might be experiencing. Cognitive empathy is something that can be achieved through understanding, through engagement and conversation with others, through reading articles, through exposure, through critical thinking. And I'm recalling back and thinking about, Patricia Hill Collins and rationalism and the importance of rationalism versus empiricism alone. That if we get into understanding the life experiences of the wealthy, the middle class, the working class, the poor, we can understand more dynamically the lived experiences of others, and we're developing empathy and understanding versus a lot of projections, misunderstanding our own biases that may come into play. So to get there, it requires a shift from reacting to things and seeking understanding. In my 201 class, we talk about, or 204, talk about the beginner's mind. So we talk about a lot of things in sociology. Let's say we're going to talk about income and wealth, the tax bracket, talk about poverty, talk about social policies like welfare, temporary assistance to needy families. People may have strong convictions about these things without actually having any basis in terms of knowledge about these programs and people's lives that are being impacted by them. So it's important to suspend judgment and trying to understand and approach it through that particular lens. Understanding, and I put these next two bullet points here because of my experience working in both in social work and as an educator, that when we talk about content and ideas that people may have strong convictions about, there can be a misunderstanding. And the misunderstanding is that when we're seeking empathy, we're trying to understand. Doesn't mean I would do the same thing in that person's shoes, or that I support that person's decision, or that I advocate for something different. It's just seeking understanding, right? So we got to get there first, understanding, versus trying to get to that before we get to that next step about, okay, well, what do I want to make of that now that I understand that individual or other people that are in that similar situation? I can understand that journey and experience. Doesn't minimize responsibility of others. It's just trying to, again, understand. We are cooperative. Humans are, I mean, we can be self-interest for sure. There's a combination of self-interest and cooperation. We survive based on our group membership, connections to others, and cooperation. So we think about it, scale that up to a society, start raising questions about, is society structured in a way to facilitate cooperation or alienation? If we're focused on cooperation, we're going to be more likely to be empathizing with others because we're seeing and valuing the perspective of others. If we get into a situation where we're alienated from others, we don't have the structure in place that's facilitating cross-class interactions and experiences, we're going to get further distant from the experience of others, and that's going to create some challenges for empathizing. Keep in mind or thinking about this idea of self-determination is an important part of social sciences, other areas to think about. It's individuals making choices within an environment and a context. Not everybody has the same choices available to them. Not everybody has the same support mechanisms to making certain choices. Not everybody has the same consequences making one choice versus another. So it's people within their environment, and we're paying attention to both. So America, as we'll talk about, or I'll talk about here, America tends to focus so much on free will that if people just worked harder, they could just advance themselves. Well, that's too much in the free will basket. There's an interrelationship. What about the class a person is born into? That doesn't determine their life outcome, but it definitely is going to have an influence on their life experiences and potential outcomes in life. So we're looking at that interrelationship and trying to understand. And what we have to do to get there, I think, is develop empathy and understanding because our culture tells a story about rugged individualism, work hard, and you will get there as well. There's a book I think pretty valuable, easy to read. Rutger Bregman's book Humankind, if you're interested, of just understand human behavior and the human experience. And I just link it here just because I think Bregman does a good job or a valuable job of investigating the human experience and who humans are. Uh, and I think to facilitate empathy, it's listening to different points of view, trying to understand different points of view, challenge our own prejudices, understanding what the commonalities between individual and different group experiences, to understand how our life experiences are different between different groups. Stepping outside of ourselves and imagining the experience of others, imagining social forces that came into play, the sociological imagination, social forces that came into play that shape people's life experiences. So we can do that either directly or indirectly, right? We can develop empathy through conversations with people, like direct one-on-one conversations. And we also can do that through reading, through investigating, through film, through different mechanisms of trying to increase understanding of others. And it becomes really important, sometimes challenging when we're trying to understand people who have different beliefs than our own. I remember for a while reading some work on different individuals involved in white supremacy and white nationalism. And I don't have to condone or support or agree with individuals belonging to those particular groups, but I can seek to understand the dynamics involved about how people enter into those spaces, the powerful forces that help them maintain involvement in those spaces. So I can think about that through that sense. That's empathy. It's seeking understanding. And if we can understand, we're humanizing each other and we can understand the social realities that people face and their influences on their lives. So I go back to Patricia Hill Collins, The Matrix of Domination, right? Empathy is a way of facilitating understanding inequities in ways that will facilitate, as a byproduct, facilitate not only understanding, but breaking apart or more critically understanding in a more critical way the relationship between privilege and domination. And I think it couldn't help but to move to a place of greater social justice and equity. Here's some things to think about, like, okay, if empathy, like direct contact or, through different ways through reading and things like that. Interesting changes and really, I think, things that undermine the ways in which our communities are structured in ways that sometimes undermine our ability to connect with each other because we're not in the same spaces anymore, or less likely, like it's increased concentration of class segregated communities, increased concentration of residential communities based on race. So I won't go through all these numbers and charts. You can spend a few minutes just looking through them, but you can see a growth in racial or in class segregation, race segregation. And that's important. You think about if our homes and our communities are segregated along these lines, um, our schools are probably going to be segregated, so kids are not interacting with people from different class, race backgrounds. It's going to be more homogenous, and it's really helpful to be in those environments in a more diverse community and society, so we can help to understand just intuitively, just being around other people, we can humanize and see each other in a more complete way. So if we get into, well, if we don't have empathy and we're not trying to understand, we just have well, these are my values, my beliefs, and I'm just going to identify them and support them regardless of whether or not they match reality or other people's experiences. That's a lack of that's coming from a lack of empathy. It's coming from an individual experience, but not about also incorporating or thinking about the experiences of others. So if we have a lot of social division, separation, we're gonna have a less we're gonna have a lower level of empathy. If there's a declining trust between groups, between individuals and society and government, there's going to be a decreased motivation for empathy, and these things can reinforce race, class, other divisions, and other separations, and ultimately lead to social policies that could be very harmful, detrimental to not only groups but to society at large. One thing important I think we can talk about that gets into stratification is we have our ideal culture, our idealized culture, the story we tell about ourselves, and then we have the reality, the practice culture. And what's interesting to look at is trying to understand, okay, what's that narrative and story that a nation, that the United States tells about itself when it comes to income and wealth and material accomplishment? What's the story? Where does that story come from? How's that story reinforced? This is hegemony, go to the matrix of domination, like hegemonic, the structure, right, of influencing values and beliefs. But every nation has an idealized culture. And then every nation has a practice culture, the reality of how it gets carried out in day-to-day life. And that may be intersectional, right? So we have the story that if people just work hard enough, that they can get to a piece of the American dream. That idea is going to meet a different reality, the practice culture, depending on person's class, race, other factors. Doesn't mean that people's efforts don't matter. What it means is we're trying to put effort into a larger context. If we just hold on to idealism, this idea that, for example, if you just work hard enough, you can make it, that America is this land of opportunity, equal to everyone, open to everyone. If we hold on to that idea without looking at the practice reality, I think we protect the system from critique. We're not going to be ever, we're going to be immobilized to get closer to that idealized culture. The only way we can get closer to that idealized professed culture is to understand what's being practiced. Like that's and make a decision. Well, okay, there's a difference between the two. There's a gap. Do we want to close that gap becomes the question. If people don't want to engage in conversations about the ideal culture or where it comes from and the practice culture, I always question, well, why not? It doesn't seems like it would be valuable to do this. So what's the resistance? Where's that coming from? And who benefits from the lack of engagement and critical thinking about idealized and a practice culture? And our goal is to more objectively understand. Um, there's a book called, I'll reference it later, Fantasyland, How America Went Haywire, 500-Year History. Interesting book, just if you're interested in sort of a longer term perspective, American culture, this idealized version, this sort of fantasy land, right? The story we tell. But that's been part of America since colonization. So it's a deeply rooted story that is hard to change. I want to provide a perspective in thinking about fairness. Like we all have ideas about what is fair. How we view fairness is influenced by social and cultural factors. It's probably influenced by class, social class. It's influenced by our life experiences. Ideas of fairness are not innate. I say that with a little bit of hesitation because in animal behavior, animals do have a sense of fairness, but they're not conceptualizing it. They're not conceptualizing it like we humans cognitively conceptualizing ideas of fairness. We learn, we define, we construct ideas about fairness, and they're culturally they're different across cultures. So in Finland, they value equality and fairness and individualism. We value those three things as well in the United States, maybe in a different, we weight those things in a different way. Um, where in Finland is a country where the inequality is relatively low and the United States relatively high. We're on the other end of that scale. And part of it is thinking about, well, how did we get there? There's a lot of factors. This isn't like the only factor. But if we as American culture think an idea of fairness, that if everybody gets the same, that's fair, that's going to lead to reinforcing inequality and reinforcing, it's not addressing the inequality. So, to give you an example, if all states gave a certain dollar amount per student in a K through 12 school, in a public school, they gave the same dollar amount regardless of a student's class background, then it means that students that actually are in underserved, in communities that have more economic challenges, those students um, will need and benefit from additional resources to be able to address the inequalities within society itself. So, Finland, they wouldn't have less of a problem with that idea. It's like, well, you put resources where resources are most needed. Kids from a real wealthy background, that the dollar amount is less impactful or differently impactful than a community in a lower class community. So the example in Finland to go through is that think about is the speeding ticket. This is not only Finland, but in Switzerland, Germany, other countries that your fine is based on your income bracket. So they actually will scan, a law enforcement officer will scan your driver's license, your income bracket will come up, and your fine is based on your income bracket. And that's a percentage of income, right? So that's a different idea of fairness that, okay, well, you're going to pay your fine is 3% of your annual income. If you made $300,000, it's that was your tax, that was your income for last year, then you paid 3% off of $100,000. If you made $50,000, it's 3% of that. That's an idea of fairness that's learned, right? We have a different idea of fairness, same fee, same fine for everyone, regardless of how much people earn. So ideas, beliefs matter, and they impact things like policy. Um, it's not that there's one way of forming idea of fairness. There's different ideas, different culture, and there's not one right way. Our way is not wrong. Finland's is not right. Different ways of doing things, different ways of organizing. There's different consequences too. And if we look at overall societal well-being, America is the richest country in terms of gross domestic product, but we are relatively low for all kinds of indicators of society well-being, mental health, addictions, child mortality rates, healthcare factors or health factors, a lot of different factors that we rank relatively low because we're not investing in institutions and supports within our communities and society. All right, so theme number three are dominant ideologies. So ideologies are the lenses that we view through which we view the world. They are influenced by our values, our beliefs, or assumptions, or influenced by, our ideologies within them are contained within them are values, beliefs, and assumptions we have about how the world operates, about who other people are. So these are ideologies. They influence our thoughts, our behavior. So from a micro level, our individual world, to thinking about structure, and there's a relationship between the two. We don't come out of the womb with ideologies, we learn them. For an ideology about the role of the government, should the government be involved, or to what degree of addressing economic inequality? Well, people are going to have values and beliefs about that, and that's going to be ideologically driven. There's a difference between ideology and evidence, right? So let's kind of like, it's be important to differentiate between ideologies and evidence-driven um, stuff. Ideologies provide a justification for why things are the way that they are. So if we look at economic inequality, the degree of economic inequality, and we have a justification for it. So we call it meritocracy is one of them, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Ideologies are often invisible. People believe that they're true. Like, no, this is just how the world operates. And they don't recognize that these are ideologies, but they see them as being truths. And that can be a problem because it's ignoring reality itself. And in American culture, the dominant ideologies are rugged individualism, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, don't rely on anybody else, don't rely on the government, don't really, be self-sufficient, like these kind of things. There's some value in those spaces, but there's limitations too, and there's consequences by not addressing the environment component and life chances and things like that. This idea of meritocracy, I'll define in a minute too, but that's another dominant ideology. Sometimes we blame either individuals or we blame a culture, an ethnic group for their own poverty or for their wealth or their achievement. And we hold it at like an ethnic group level versus trying to understand the structural conditions, access to resources, education, healthcare, the way communities are organized, all those structural things from a sociological viewpoint are the driving forces. And these other things, looking at the individual or looking at a culture as a way of misplacing the realities of what's causing or influencing inequality. So, give you an example, people think about welfare comes in a lot of different forms. Student financial aid is welfare. Welfare comes in a lot of different forms. Corporate welfare, given subsidies, right? But we have this idea about welfare, income maintenance for individuals who qualify or at a certain income level and below can receive government benefit called temporary assistance to needy families. Um, that was a program, and it goes before that is aid to dependents with families and children, aid to dependents of children with children. But in 1996 became temporary assistance to needy families. And the reason I sort of this is like a program to help support people who are really poor and provide an income benefit. And this is what gets contentious sometimes. It's an income benefit. But I want to kind of identify. So if you look at of the dollars that go to TANF from the federal government, and you can look at, there's a bunch of different categories. I just put three here that the financial, like getting a check from the government of the overall big pie of TANF, 22% of all federal government money going to TANF, only 22% goes to actually individuals receiving monetary money from the government every month. Individuals can access TANF for 60 months throughout their lifetime. It's time limited, 5 years that they can access. And there's conditions upon accessing TANF. The real value of TANF benefits have decreased 40% since 1996 when TANF got started. I did a comparison, just trying to look at different things. One of them is tax revenue loss to offshore tax havens for individuals and corporations or for corporations. And it's about the same. The tax revenue that the federal government loses to these offshore tax havens is relatively the same cost of running TANF in the United States. And I think we get into this reaction to welfare and lack of understanding about or addressing these other areas. It's like, okay, what's going on? And I think ideologies are shaping the ways in which we view social programs, the way we view taxes, the way we view a lot of different things. So America has a sort of focus on rugged individualism. It goes deep into American culture, early colonization, European settlement, westward expansion, believing there was a ordained responsibility, a God-given responsibility to claim land for personal use and economic development. We're a country founded on Protestant ideals, which facilitates and supports individual salvation and accomplishment, and helps support an idea of a marker of individual moral worth is their economic position. So an idea the wealthier you are, you're a more moral individual is rooted in some religious Protestant values and ideals. To build the economic engine to make America what it is required the exploitation of labor, the extermination and removal of people from their lands they occupied. So we have, an idealized version of American culture, right? But there's a practiced reality that, there's historical factors, of to get to that economic advancement as a nation. There were individuals and groups of people who were enslaved, exterminated, removed. You just kind of work through and think about, it's a complicated history and an important one to understand if we're going to more objectively understand where we're at today and understand the past. I think it's also important to understand, we have, United States, a lot of natural resources, our geographic position, but also uh, it was a blank slate. So colonization, there was no government established, no federal government established here prior to that. And so it was a blank slate that colonists could form this new country. So the fourth theme, myth of meritocracy. So merit is basically you get a merit badge, right? You've passed a test, you've demonstrated a skill, you have more merit. People who have more merit, people have, let's say, that their skills that they have, like they're an auto mechanic, they have certain skills in being an auto mechanic, and they can work on e-vehicles, they can work on diesel engines. They have more merit because of their skill set. So merit is basically the skills, talents, abilities, intelligence, educational level that people have. And there's a belief in American culture that we live in a meritocracy, that those individuals that have more of those things are what determines the degree of stratification, the gap between the top and the bottom and every rung in between. But the reason why meritocracy is a myth, it's not a reality. It's not to say that merit doesn't matter. It's just say it's a more complicated story. That what about inheritance and wealth? Clearly individuals who grow up in certain class positions, they have different resources available to them to be able to advance themselves in different directions or take opportunities in different directions. If you look at college admissions, that elite colleges, many of them are, some of them are moving away from legacy admissions. So legacy meaning if you had a family member who went to that college, you get a leg up, so to speak, in your admissions process. Well, that's no longer merit. That's like you have a family connection and history of that college, and you could probably start to see how that's going to reinforce not only class inequality, but potentially a racial inequality as well. And their structures have advantages for those three sources, even those that seem more neutral, like a merit-based scholarship based on GPA or other factors. There's social forces that are going on that increase the likelihood that individuals are going to be able to qualify for that merit-based scholarship. It's not to say that individual work and effort doesn't matter, that different individuals, regardless of where they're at in the strata, can't do different things to be able to access that scholarship. It's just going to be a different journey and a different experience based on where you're at. Discrimination, meritocracy doesn't address that very well. Systematic or systemic advantages and disadvantages. The ACT test, SAT test, doing prep courses, having access to financial resources, the schools you go to. I mean, there's a lot of things in the social context that are influencing a person's ability to perform on ACT, SAT scores. It's not just like aptitude and intelligence. It's a lot of things, other things that are going on. Social capital, the people we know, cultural capital, the things that we know that gain us access into certain classes, certain class ways of thinking and knowing. Grow up in a upper middle class family, develop cultural capital that people, when they go out to a job interview, they know the language, the style, the dress appearance. This isn't, people are being judged not necessarily on merit, but on their demonstration of understanding class culture. And this isn't consciously done. This is just kind of happens as a process. Couple different, I don't know, survey, Pew Research study, survey. Americans are the outliers. So the statement, percent who disagree that success in life is determined by forces outside of your control. Who disagree with that statement. Americans disagree with that statement. See, it's not outside of your control. And to kind of like recognize to some degree that there's some influence there, but we are the outlier. We are the furthest away data points of believing that nothing is outside of our control. People who say that's very important to work hard to get ahead, we're an outlier in this case. 73% of Americans believe it's hard work is what you need. And then look at the other, it's not, Germany is a capitalist nation. I mean, it's a mixed economy like the United States is as well. So it's not, it's understanding, okay, what's going on in American culture and Germany, what's going on in Germany or India, like what's their culture that's shaping how they view inequality. We're the outlier. There's research, fascinating research on perceptions of the degree of inequality. Americans tend to believe that inequality is about like this. They believe that the ideal society is one where it actually be more like this. And the reality is more like this. So our perceptions of inequality, we believe it's much more equal than it actually is. It'd be interesting to see data points on specific age demographics of that data about that, and maybe different, different regions of the country and things like that. I'm going to skip over number five. I'm going to remove this slide here. We're not worried about it, but basically the idea is learners, the researcher, psychologist believes that every people around the world want to believe the world is a just place. And this prevents us from dealing with inequality because we believe the world is just kind of like this individualistic kind of perspective. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but we'll just kind of leave it be at that. Um, Let's go to theme number six here, looking at social mobility, moving up and down. We can look at intra-generation within a generation. So your own journey throughout your life, you're going to be in different class positions probably. And then there's intergenerational across generations. And then there's structural social mobility. So when the structure of society shifts, and that's where the articles for this week, next week, there's going to be a lot of content related to structural social mobility. I referenced two books here. This one is from the 1980s. William Julius Wilson, African American scholar from Harvard, sociologist who's looks at, I think it's a great example, empirical evidence of looking at what happens when jobs disappear, economic struggles go on, what happens to the community, what happens in that space. The problem is when there's been a structural shift, when we go from manufacturing jobs and they leave, what's going to fill its place and what's the impact on the community. And then closer to home, Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Wudun do focus on Oregon and Yamhill, Oregon. It's a pretty tough read, hard to read in terms of just emotionally hard to read, but a really powerful book. So we live in a called post-industrial economy. If you go back to 1900, 40% of Americans were farmers. Now it's making less than 2%. We've moved from manufacturing to service-oriented economy. Started in the 1970s, it's service and information age. The rise of globalization, transnational corporations, no longer just corporations operating in the United States. Think about like Rockefeller from back in the day, or Carnegie and Steel these were the barons back in the early 1900s. Now it's transnational corporations. I mean, so the level of money and power and influence is much more significant. We have in this new economy that 1940s, 1950s unionization rate of labor unions, groups that are organized and supporting labor and advocating for labor, were relatively high in the United States. Now they're we're the lowest in economically developed countries in terms of labor union membership. We're about 13% of our employees are covered by labor unions. And of that 13%, the majority are public employees, teachers, firefighters, law enforcement. So private sector labor union folks is really small in the United States, and that influences economic inequality. We also have like something shifted in our economy, like look at the requirement of education. Um, that more and more education is required to get your foot into the workforce and jobs and positions that are higher paying. Not always so, but it's something that's shifted in our economy, that's shifted in the ways in which we operate because our economy, different jobs, different employment sectors than existed 40, 50 years ago. Uh, that's interesting. If you look at the median annual earning of full-time workers, age 25 to 32, I don't worry about that in 2012, but in 1965, look at the gap between the top and the bottom, or bachelor's degree, high school degree. And what's gone on is like more and more people, okay, 38% now have a bachelor's degree or higher, and that gap is grown, right? It's another way of getting at this post-industrial structural shift that happened in society. And higher education is getting more and more, it's expensive. So accessing it is different. That's going to create even further divide and separation. Let's see. So then we get into like back in the 1950s, 1960s for that people called it white flight, where whites, middle class, professional middle class were leaving urban centers. This is part because of after Brown versus Board of Education, which is the law, Supreme Court ruling that ended segregation in the United States. that there was a movement of whites leaving cities to move out to the suburbs. Suburbs were developing. There were racially exclusive neighborhoods and communities where actually people of color were not allowed to purchase a home in these communities. Well, that was the past. We're in a different stage now. We're in interstate flight where people are moving to areas of country or parts of the country that fit their political economic interest, that are more homogenous. So talk about empathy, right? That there's a book from Bill Bishop called The Big Sort, that people are moving to communities that are more politically more similar to their own political ideologies and beliefs. Well, if that starts to happen, we're going to start to create lack of opportunity of, fewer opportunities to have cross-political conversations and being around individuals with different political parties than our own. And that's going to be potentially consequential. If you look at the average CEO to the average worker, in 1970, the average CEO earned 15 times the average worker. Now it's around 300. From 1978 to 2019, average worker compensation increased by 18% and CEOs by 1,300 or more. So major shift in our economy, major shift in organization. This is a structural shift, including also you look at the effective tax rate. Top 1%, 65 to 1980 was 70%. Back post World War II, the effective tax rate was around 90% for the top. And the bottom, you look at the bottom 50% hasn't really changed from 65 to today. But what's gone on is basically the top 1% is their effective tax rate has been dropped in half. So these things are going on, right? These are policies. There's not one right way for a tax policy, but there's a lot of ideology that's driving them, and then tax policies can influence degrees of inequality. Okay, so now for the content for this week. So the first one is a podcast with Annette LaRue, and she's talking about the ways in which inequality are reinforced through things like parenting, and that our parents parent based on their own social class sensibilities. And so there's no one right way of parenting, just different kind of class cultures with parenting. And what LaRue is kind of getting at is what the work of Pierre Bourdieu, a French theorist, of looking at social reproduction of inequality. So I wanted to move us in a direction of thinking about, well, inequality can happen because of things like access to education, resources, this, that, and the other, the structure. It also can happen culturally. So growing up in an environment where parents are parenting in different ways can provide sometimes institutional advantages for some kids who grow up with learning a cultural repertoire that they can access and utilize for moving themselves in different places in the system. So that's the podcast. And then choose one of the following two interviews and discussions in Sun Magazine. They're both of them are great, interesting, informative. The second one, Milkman, I think both of them address structural inequality. I've read them both many times. I probably would gravitate towards the Milkman article. And then next week, there's a short TED Talk, Michael Sandel, Harvard University professor, who's devoted a lot of his recent career to looking at this issue of meritocracy, the myth of it, and when he calls the tyranny of merit, that even if you could do it, it's problematic, and his arguments and perspective why. And then Matthew Desmond, who's addressing basically America is committed to poverty. Like we are not dealing with the structural realities that's causing it. We're not moving us in a different direction. So he's taken a really critical approach of America's policies related to economic inequality. All right, that's a lot of content. Hope everything's going well. A lot of important things to investigate. Enjoy the materials for this week and next week, and have a great day.